Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Earthly Delights podcast. Today, our guest is Dr. Gordon C. Nagayama Hall, who is a professor of psychology in the clinical psychology program at the University of Oregon. Dr. Hall received his PhD in clinical psychology from Fuller Theological Seminary. His blog for psychology today is Life in the Intersection, a Multicultural Psychology Approach, and his research interests are in culture and mental health with a particular interest in Asian Americans. Dr. Gordon Hall, thanks for doing this. What's the crack? How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me. I've been coping with this pandemic as we all are, but it's nice to be interviewed and appreciate your interest in my work.
No, yeah, we're very much looking forward to it. I guess the first question we usually ask, and I want to ask you, is how has your interest in this area evolved, or just can you give us a bit of a background to yourself?
Yes, I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and my grandparents on my mother's side were from Japan. And
Okay.
because my mother and her family were from Japan during World War II, they were put into concentration camps in Posen, Arizona. So they lived in California and they were moved to Arizona. And so that violation of civil rights was something that shaped my identity. My mother told me
Mm.
about that situation, and I was aware of being an Asian American. And this was something that interested me and was something that I wanted to study. I took a psychology class in high school, and although it wasn't focused on culture or social justice, it did seem to be a way where I could study my interest in human behavior. And then I went to the University of Washington as an undergraduate and then to Fuller Theological Seminary, as you mentioned. And there I began to focus on my interest in culture and mental health. And my career has been circuitous. I began studying sexually aggressive behavior because there were opportunities in that area. Then I began to integrate my interests in culture with sexual aggression, looking at risk protective factors associated with sexual aggression. And then in the last 15 or so years, I focused exclusively on culture and mental health, particularly cultural adaptations of psychotherapy.
Perfect. Dr. Gordon, I just want to. I mean, I guess start as we mean to go on. I've got a fairly big question here. Basically, the more and more I'm becoming like fascinated with the idea of self and identity. And we've had a few podcasts that have kind of touched on those themes. And I've long since been an admirer of Japanese history, language, and culture. Ever since I saw The Last Samurai when I was young, so maybe I'm guilty of romanticizing anything that's even slightly linked with Japan. Um, but that being said, I've recently read the book of How the World Thinks by Julian Baggini, which is a book that neatly compares and dissects the world's philosophies. And in it, there's a chapter called The Relational Self, and it goes on to explain that in Japan, there is a strong pro-social culture, and Westerners often confuse as conformist. One of the examples given is of the image of Japanese men and women boarding a train, and he goes on to state that the reason that they board a train in such an orderly fashion is because it's in the interest of everybody else, not because they're trying to fit in. And then he goes on to state and quote that the nature of any individual is determined by how that individual stands in relation to others. Take away those relations, and you're not left with a self stripped down to its essence, but a self stripped of its essence. This seems to be in stark contrast with the typical Western individualistic, kind of reductionistic view of the self, and anything else for that matter, I guess. Another clear example of this sense of self in relation to others is in the Japanese language, which I love, whereby the pronoun such as I is simply dropped as it's of no great importance, and the word for human is ningen, if I pronounce that correctly. I'm not sure, which consists of nin meaning human and yen meaning space or between, kind of again illustrating that sense of relation and self. So I guess my question is, do you think this philosophical viewpoint is helpful when seeking to solve problems related to mental health? And are there any negative aspects to it that my affection for Japan has kind of concealed from me?
Sure. So thank you for that question. Mental health in the West tends to be conceptualized as residing within the individual,
Mm,
and treatment focuses on the individual, whether it be medication or psychotherapy, and interpersonal relationships and the ability to fit into a group are de emphasized or even overlooked. An example of how this interconnectedness can benefit everyone is some work by Brenda Campos in California on familism. Familism is a sense of connection to one's family and putting the priorities of one's family over one's own priorities.
mm,
And she's found that for various ethnic groups, for Asian Americans, for African Americans, for Latinx Americans, and even for white Americans, a connection to one's family is associated with better mental health. And this is something that's typically not emphasized. So some would say for college students who Brenda Campos studied, for college students to be overly connected to their family or dependent on their family is not a good thing. But what she found is that even for young adult college students, that connections to family facilitated mental health, reduced depression, and is a good thing. So I
mm.
think the West has a rather narrow definition and focus on the individual as the source of mental illness and mental health.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you touched on that because, I think Westerners are often perplexed by the deep connection between the individual and the group that's kind of present all over East Asia. And there was like a really striking example that I read where a South Korean ferry that capsized, unfortunately, killing 304 passengers, including students who were on a school trip. And the school's vice principal, who organized that trip, actually survived, unfortunately took his own life later on and left a note in which he said, "I take full responsibility." And then a newspaper commentator actually went on to say, "Our nation has run headlong toward the goal of becoming wealthy, but we turned a blind eye to the goal of becoming a civilized and safe society," showing how he believed society had to shoulder the blame for this tragedy, not a single man. However odd this may seem to a Westerner, it would appear that we can kind of appreciate the sentiment, but in a slightly distorted way, because I guess we feel immense pride in the success of our family members, often sharing the glory, but we very rarely take any responsibility for their failures. Do you believe that when a family member of ours is suffering with mental health, that we should take some responsibility and not see it as a personal affliction, and therefore also seek to rehabilitate with that person suffering?
Yes, there is a context for any kind of psychological problem, and the family has some responsibility. In the United States, we tend to be very individualistic, and
Yeah.
people don't want to be blamed for their family members' problems. But there is a context in which mental health problems occur. And also, families can be mobilized to help a person heal.
Hmm.
So the family context is very important, and there is some shared responsibility, but that's not an emphasis in the United States. In a positive sense, a person can be free from any burdens of being connected to one's family, but in a negative sense, the family can be a source of support and healing. And if a person is disconnected from their family, they lose those potential benefits.
Mm. And when talking about the kind of the positives and the negatives in some of your work, in fact, in one of your papers, I'm just going to title it in case anyone wants to go to read it, called "Coping as a Mediator Between Losing Face and Depressive and Social Anxiety Symptoms Among Asian Americans." It stated that the loss of face describes the failure of an individual to meet obligations placed upon him or her by members of his or her in group, losing face implies that one has shamed members of his or her family through one's actions. Face concerns differ from Western concepts of shame and embarrassment because it extends beyond the individual and affects members of one's in-group, which ties into the kind of previous questions, I guess. You talk about maintaining the loss of face's protective mechanisms while mitigating its negative psychological effects. Could you kind of talk more about that? What do you mean by the positives and the negatives? And what is there that maybe someone who isn't Asian or come from any Asian descent, what could we learn from that loss of face?
Yeah, so loss of face is multidimensional. With respect
Mm-hmm.
to depression, it tends to suppress emotional expression and prevent help seeking. On the other hand, if a person sees help seeking as a way of saving face for themselves and their family, face concerns could motivate help seeking. The weight of the evidence, however, suggests that face concerns interfere with disclosure problems and help seeking. However, face concerns are also associated with impulse control, which can prevent aggressive behavior, which I found in my research on sexual aggression. So,
Mm.
loss of face in the West, it's not something that drives behavior because there is less connection to others, and one's own behavior doesn't necessarily have implication for one's family or one's group. But this concern about face uh, could be could be conceptualized in the West as something that uh, uh, so an attempt to save face could help not only oneself but others in one's group, one's family, one's work group, and so forth. But it's a foreign concept for the most part for people in the West.
Do you think that we can, that this sense of loss of face, does that kind of lose its effect or lose its potency, I guess, as the generations go on? Or is it something that keeps its potency regardless of whether you're a second generation Asian American or a fifth generation Asian American?
There's evidence that loss of face and other cultural patterns persist through 4 generations in the United States. Asian American identity, including loss of face, persists in the United States because, in part, it's distinctive from mainstream individualistic values, and also because Asian Americans are often treated as perpetual foreigners. In other words, they aren't allowed to assimilate even if they wish to. So these patterns
Mm.
persist at least through 4 generations in the United States.
And so that's a really interesting point about the assimilation. Do you think that is because I find it funny, and almost paradoxical when you think that, I mean, almost unless you're a Native American, anyone in America comes from some sort of immigration background, right? But yet, you Irish Americans, Italian Americans are seen as much more quote unquote American. Do you think that that's because purely because of how they're seen? I mean, physically speaking, I mean, maybe their features are less recognizable. Do you think that makes it easier for maybe an Italian American to assimilate the American culture easier than maybe an Asian American? I'm just trying to figure out what the difference is.
Physical features are part of it, but assimilation to a foreign country's philosophy or culture depends on the distance of one's culture of origin from the country's philosophy or
Right,
culture.
that's psychic distance.
In the U.S., white European immigrants often have an easier time assimilating than East Asian immigrants. When there's distance between a culture of origin and the foreign culture, assimilation may be difficult, even across generations. Distinctive cultural traditions, such as emphasis on the group more than the self, as we've been discussing, are often
Mm.
maintained. Sometimes a person isn't allowed to assimilate by those in the foreign culture. For example, most Asian Americans are immigrants, and those Asian Americans who were born in the U.S. and whose parents or grandparents were immigrants continue to be perceived as immigrants rather than as part of the mainstream.
Right. Okay. And do you believe? I mean, I'm interested. We're both multicultural, and I've always struggled with the sense of identity because in England, I was always seen as the Italian guy, and then when I'd go over to Italy to see my cousins, I would always be introduced as the English cousin. So I was neither English nor Italian. I was never had both feet in any camp. Have you ever struggled with that being Asian American yourself? And have you found that in your research?
Yes, this issue of neither here nor there is common for people with multicultural identities. My maternal grandparents immigrated from Japan to California, as I mentioned, and when I
Mm.
visited Japan, I felt very American. Yet in the United States, I feel that my Japanese cultural background is distinctive. So I'm an Asian American rather than only an American. My colleague Teresa Laframboise at Stanford University has proposed that being able to alternate between two cultures rather than choose one over the other is the most adaptive form of acculturation.
Right. And do you think what do you think for someone who is multicultural, what do you think is most influential in their upbringing? Would you say it's the country's culture or the culture that they have within the house? My example would be I was brought up and lived my whole life in England. Yeah, felt very Italian because within the household, we lived a very Italian lifestyle. The food we ate, the beliefs that we had, within my four walls was very Italian. But obviously, once I stepped outside that front door, I was obviously confronted with England and English culture. Is there any kind of research that would show which is more influential?
For children earlier in development, the family is more influential, and then during adolescence, peers become more influential. And then as adults, a person can choose their environment more. So that choice
Right.
of environment becomes influential and is based on family and peer influences. So at different stages of development, there are different influences. So if one's peers are English, in your case,
Hmm.
you'll have more pressure to acculturate than if your peers were Italians and shared the traditions of your family. So the the influence of family depends on one stage of development. Family influences tend to recede as one reaches adolescence and adulthood, although they can persist depending on how one maintains peer relationships with those from one's culture of origin.
Ah.
Thanks for that, Gordon. I did want to ask about the impact on the succession of generations on one's identity. When I say this, I mean, do you believe that Asian identity will remain with your children or grandchildren as long as Japanese culturisms are still present within the family? I asked partly because many Irish people joke about Irish Americans identifying as Irish, even if it was their great great grandparent that was actually from Ireland. And I was wondering, is there a similar level of judgmentalism in Japan towards second and third generation Asian Americans? And what effect, if any, have you seen? What effect can this have?
So in Japan, Asian Americans are seen as not authentically Japanese. I'm half Japanese, and when I've gone to Japan, sometimes people wonder why I can't speak Japanese and treat me as if I've lost my culture. Also, during the period in which my grandparents came to the United States, the people from Japan who came to the United States were those who were the second child or third child, or people who weren't able to afford to stay in Japan. So I think there is some stigma around being an Asian American in Japan. In terms of in the United States, whether the identity persists. So my children went to a Japanese language immersion school and learned Japanese, and uh, but they're very acculturated.
Mm.
And perhaps the most acculturated is my oldest daughter, who married a white American. But she named her daughter, my granddaughter, Emiko Takara, which is a Japanese name. And her full name is Emiko Takara Nagayama Hall. So three of her names are Japanese. And there is some sense of Japanese identity, even in this fourth generation child. So I think there is effort to maintain these distinct traditions because they are distinct and they can be seen as helpful or facilitating one's connection to others. But as I said, there's also with some groups who look different, they're not entirely accepted as Americans or part of the mainstream.
Do you think, as a society, we need to maybe ease these immediate reactions? You know, if somebody sees somebody who may not look whatever authentically American is or authentically Irish is, that we should still give them their space to explain their identity. You know, personally, I feel like we are very judgmental and to say, "Oh, they're not Italian because of this," or "They're not Irish because of this," when really identity is a very personal thing. Do you think, or let me ask, have you seen an improvement in this maybe awareness or openness for or a reluctance to judge over the last few decades?
I would like to say yes, but I'm talking to you during the coronavirus pandemic, and there have been a number of anti Asian discrimination incidents, even in my own town, where Asian Americans have been shunned at grocery stores, for example, or even yelled at and physically attacked. And there's been an uptick in these incidents
Oh God.
in the last couple of months since the coronavirus has become evident. So
Mm.
I would like to say that there's been an improvement, but I think some of these issues are lying just beneath the surface.
Yeah, Gordon, like you said, that those kind of problems are lying dormant and kind of almost waiting to spring up when given the opportunity. Could you talk about? We spoke about in conversation before the podcast about why, for example, Asians are so readily accept wearing masks and have done actually before the coronavirus outbreak, whereas most Westerners, this isn't actually just the US, because in England and in the UK it's very similar. They feel as if it's almost an attack on their individuality. Could you kind of expand on that point? Because when you mentioned it in talking, it really kind of opened my eyes.
Yes, face masks are commonly worn in Japan and other East Asian countries to protect others from one's own germs. In the United States and apparently in other Western countries, the primary purpose of face masks is to protect oneself from the germs of others. Last year, I was on a
Mm.
plane flight in the US and I heard someone coughing 2 rows behind me. When the flight was over, I looked back and saw that the coughing person was not wearing a mask, but a person next to him was wearing a mask. Some
Mm.
Americans don't want to wear masks because they feel it violates their individual rights.
Yeah, and then you linked it so beautifully. Not to make this an anti-gun or pro-gun debate, but that's the reason why, for example, you were saying how Japan has that strict gun culture, maybe, and doesn't have the mass shootings, whereas in the US it does. No.
That's correct. Japan has strict gun control laws and no mass shootings, and the good of the country precludes individual rights to own weapons. In contrast, the United States tolerates mass shootings, including deaths of children, in exchange for individual gun rights.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you put it like that, it just kind of the penny dropped, and I was like, oh, that is hit the nail on the head. But I wanted to come back slightly just to the assimilation that we were talking about beforehand. I mean, in your paper on becoming multicultural in a monocultural research world, a conceptual approach to studying ethnocultural diversity, you state that in assimilationist societies, minority groups and immigrant groups are supposed to abandon their cultural norms and adapt to the host country norms. However, in more multicultural societies, groups are encouraged to maintain their cultural norms. In general, most majority groups, i.e., European Americans in the United States, tend to favor assimilation strategies, whereas many minority groups are said to favor multicultural approaches. With that being said, do you believe that it is actually possible to fully assimilate to a foreign country's culture and philosophy? And if so, would this be classified as cultural appropriation, which is, in the public domain a lot these days, or is this just simply successful cultural adaptation?
I'm not sure that for some groups that it is possible to completely assimilate.
Mm.
As we've discussed, if you have some visible difference or cultural difference, that's not seen as part of the mainstream. In a multicultural society, there'd be many different components and elements that are different. But when there is a dominant cultural group, such as in the United States, where it's white Americans, if you're different from the mainstream, if you're different from the dominant group, it's difficult to entirely assimilate.
Mm-hmm.
Cultural appropriation involves the adoption and misuse of another culture's practices. So I'm not quite sure that cultural appropriation, applies to this case. I suppose if someone comes to another foreign country and misuses the country's customs, perhaps it might be cultural appropriation. But in terms of the main question about assimilation, as I've mentioned before, some groups are more assimilable than others just because of physical and cultural similarities to the dominant culture. If one is different from the dominant culture, it's difficult to become assimilated, particularly when there's a single dominant group.
Mm.
Gordon, you mentioned the misuse of said culture. Is this not partly open to interpretation? If for instance, an Irish person spends 30 years in Italy and then they start maybe creating what they believe to be a hybrid of his or her two cultures. But then maybe some Italians did think this is a misuse. Is the problem there? Because is the problem or the bigger problem when we say cultural misappropriation is that it is open to interpretation and that there are no like strict lines or guidelines?
That's correct. There aren't strict guidelines, but it would be a little like plagiarism. So it's having one's own work taken by someone else and claimed as their own and sometimes embellished or changed. But you're correct. Cultural appropriation is in the eye of the beholder. So in Eugene, Oregon, where I live, there's relatively few Asian Americans, but there are Asian restaurants that cater to non-Asian customers, in part to stay in business. And so the kind of Japanese food they make is not what you get in Japan. You could call it a hybrid. I'm not sure it really is a hybrid, but it is adapted for people in Eugene. In fact, there's a Japanese man who owns a ramen restaurant in Eugene. He studied in Japan, but he makes the ramen in a way that people in Eugene like it rather than the authentic ramen that is in Japan. So I would consider that cultural appropriation, but people in Eugene like the food and he stays in business. So it is a matter of perspective.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that point, Gordon, because I think we agree. Jim and I often go back to back over Italian food and what I would class as cultural appropriation by putting cream in carbonaras. But yeah, I wanted to ask, I've read the book, How the World Thinks, and it really kind of opened up expanded my view on how actually philosophy and culture dictates how we think and act without us even knowing. And then I wondered if you think that people are aware of the impact that philosophy and culture plays in our day-to-day lives, especially when you think that one's one's culture may be foreign to their current environment. For example, someone like yourself who obviously has a Japanese background and thus must, at least in part, be influenced by Eastern philosophy whilst living in America, the patron of Western ideals. I mean, do you believe that if we had a clearer understanding of differences and similarities of worldwide philosophies and cultures, we would be better we'd better understand immigrants living in our own countries and maybe even be more compassionate towards them?
I do, but many people don't understand that they have a culture, particularly if they haven't traveled outside their own culture. So it's like the fish in water, that the water is there, but it isn't perceptible to people who live in it all the time. Most Americans are monolingual and monocultural, and there aren't many incentives to become multicultural, to travel, to learn about other cultures or languages. So, yes, I think that becoming more aware of other cultures could make us more accepting and sympathetic toward immigrants, but there isn't currently much incentive to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of links beautifully onto some of your studies with ethnic matching. And in the very first line actually of your paper, The Components of Cultural Match in Psychotherapy, it stated that pairing ethnic minority clients seeking mental health treatment with therapists that share the same ethnic background has been demonstrated to increase treatment utilization and lower rates of dropout. It strikes me that whilst this is seemingly glaringly obvious, there isn't actually too much discussion about this, and something that I had never considered when thinking about getting a therapist myself. We often hear that people need to find the right therapist for them, but hardly ever hear that they need to find the right cultural match. Why do you believe that this seemingly simple point is being overlooked in the public domain?
I think there isn't much diversity in the psychology workforce, particularly in the United States. 88% of the psychology workforce in the United States is white. But in terms of why therapist client ethnic match might work, I use this analogy of being in a new city and choosing a Japanese restaurant. If I'm walking through an area of a city where there are restaurants and I see two Japanese restaurants, one that has Japanese cooks and the other that has non Japanese cooks, I'm going to pick the one that has the Japanese cooks. Now, that doesn't guarantee that the food is better, but the Japanese cooks are a signal that the food could be more authentic. That's not to say that non Japanese cooks couldn't learn to cook authentic Japanese food, but that's just a proxy for good food. Therapist client ethnic matching tends to have some initial positive effects in terms of keeping ethnic minority clients from dropping out of treatment after a single session. So this is a little bit like me choosing a Japanese restaurant with Japanese cooks. It may attract them to treatment, but the initial effects of ethnic matching seem to wear off over time. As a client spends more time in treatment, the effectiveness of the methods that the therapist uses becomes more influential than the therapist's ethnicity.
Right, right, and I mean, you mentioned there the overwhelming percentage of professionals in the mental health sector that are white, and I mean, obviously, the aim would be to have a more diversified workforce. However, with that be, I mean, obviously there are signs that that's happening, but maybe at a slower rate than we would want. Do you think it's on the onus, for a therapist? I'm just the example. If you had a European white American therapist and their patient happened to be Asian American, do you think the onus is on that therapist to actually do a bit of research into their cultural backgrounds, to maybe understand, understand their patient more, basically, and be able to give them a more tailored and personalized service and efficient service as well.
Yes, it is important to understand your client's cultural background. We would hope that that happens during training, but that doesn't always happen because the people doing the training aren't diverse themselves. So it is important to understand a client's cultural background, but it's also important not to stereotype. So just because a person happens to be an Asian American doesn't mean that they have a strong ethnic identity, or it doesn't mean that they are immigrants. They could be very acculturated. They could want the type of treatment that is the standard treatment because they took a psychology class and they learned about cognitive behavior therapy, for example. So the therapist should have some cultural understanding, but know when to generalize and when to individualize. It's similar to science in what we call hypothesis testing. So you have a certain amount of information and you have some predictions or hunches, and you want to determine if, in this particular case with your client, if what you know about Asian Americans applies to this person fully or partially or perhaps not at all.
Right. And something else that really stood out when I was reading your research was that due to the way that obviously we all communicate very differently, and that communication can be influenced by your culture, that a lot of ethnic minorities can actually be misdiagnosed due to the monocultural nature of most professionals within the health sector. I mean, could it really be that there is a lack of misunderstanding? There's lack of understanding, sorry, when it comes to diagnosing ethnic minorities with mental health problems. For example, in your study, a meta-analysis of cultural adaptations or psychological interventions, for anyone wanted to read it, you found that people of Chinese ancestry express depression via somatic symptoms, which can often be overlooked in a European American dominated sector.
That's right. So mental health problem expression may differ culturally, and if a person has physical health problems that are a result of mental health problems, most clinicians in the United States are not trained to detect those problems or see those problems as the problem. They would say, "Well, sure, you have problems sleeping, or you don't have energy, but that's because of your emotions." Well, emotions in many East Asian cultures are not seen as informative, and they tend to express their distress physically uh, because emotional expression could upset group harmony. So physical illness is something that draws sympathy. It's seen as something that one can't control, whereas emotional problems are seen as something that one can control and could imbalance the group. So these physical expressions of distress sometimes are overlooked or misdiagnosed and not directly addressed as the problem. And if a client of East Asian background comes to a therapist and wants to sleep better or wants to have more energy or wants to have a better appetite, and the therapist is focusing on their emotions, they may drop out of therapy because they believe that the therapy is irrelevant to their problems.
Right.
Mhm.
And how do, I mean, what find interesting is obviously you spoke about kind of the potential negatives, the positives and the negatives, sorry, for ethnic matching. But some of the positives were really kind of startling that I found. For example, Latino or Latina clients were nearly 5 times more likely to discuss sexual identity issues when ethnically matched. And Asian Americans, the most common issue discussed was academic concerns when ethnically matched. Kind of really, which really surprised me in both aspects. How how can we kind of overcome this problem of monoculture dominated society catering to these ethnic minorities seeking help?
I think it involves cultural competence again, learning about different cultures in one's training, and not only in one's training, but in one's life experiences. Training only goes so far if one doesn't have life experiences that are authentic. A client can see through that. It's also a matter of trying to match clients with the types of treatments that they find most relevant. In some of my current work, we found that many Asian Americans, prefer a more pragmatic problem solving approach to problems rather than one that is focused on thoughts and emotions. The problem solving approach may address issues at school or work or within one's family. And this externally focused approach allows a client to save face because they aren't seen as having a personal mental illness, but they have a problem that can be addressed and solved. But some more mainstream conventional therapists would see the focus on problems as superficial and that the real issue, so to speak, is one's emotions and thoughts. But for many Asian Americans, they're looking for problem solutions, and if the therapist can't provide those, they may drop out of treatment.
Gordon, do you think that we have generally an issue with untangling ourselves from our culture, and that maybe this is the source of a lot of anxiety or difficulties?
Tell me a little more about what you mean by that.
I guess I want to ask, do you think that people who have been brought up in a very strong culture and been reminded that this culture, these are the things that we prioritize, often that these priorities that the culture have given or placed high are given as okay. Sorry, this is difficult. I wanted to ask: do you think that we too often go to our default culture or surroundings rather than actually taking a step back and realizing that maybe I am Latino or maybe I am Asian American, but this part of me is not, or not stereotypically, and I am different here, and I still need to express this.
Sure, I think we tend to default toward what is familiar to us, whatever our background is. I think in the United States, however, there is this dominant white European American culture that doesn't often allow much latitude for people from other cultural groups. So the expectation and pressure is to assimilate or to become more like the mainstream, even though for some people that's not possible, either because they don't want to or because they want to but are not allowed to. So I think the answer is yes.
Thanks, Gordon.
And Gordon, I wanted to ask: do you believe that it's possible to almost be a magpie and kind of take parts of either cultures and philosophies that you kind of admire or you aspire to kind of incorporate into your life? I'm thinking, for example, about the relational self, the idea of relational self, which is very present in Eastern Asia. And is just seen as the norm, but over here in the Western world, it's not, and we're kind of more involved with the atomized self. And yet, however, to me, whilst growing up in the Western world my whole life, I actually find the relational self much more intriguing and much more attractive philosophy that I would like to incorporate into myself and into the way that I see myself in relation to others, rather as just focusing on me. Do you believe that people can actually kind of just take little bits of different cultures here and there and mold it into one to then kind of have their own personal culture, so to speak, I guess?
I think that can happen. It's interesting that you use the term magpie. That's not a word I've heard since my father passed several years ago, but I think magpie was something he got from his English parents. And I must confess, I never understood what a magpie was or is. But sure, I think that actually is adaptive to be able to alternate between cultures, as Teresa Lomfrog-Boyes of Stanford calls it, where you integrate different parts of cultures into your own personality, where you take the strengths of different cultures and capitalize on them. So I think being a cultural magpie, if you want to call it that, can be adaptive.
And then I guess my other question would be for people who kind of are familiar with your background and maybe have read your research, or maybe for those who aren't, could you give us any clear examples of where cultural adaptation has been used successfully in psychotherapy treatments?
Sure. So Guillermo Bernal is a psychologist in Puerto Rico, and he has culturally adapted treatments for depression for adolescents. And he's incorporated various aspects of Puerto Rican culture, language, metaphors, religion, family influences. And what he's found is that these cultural adaptations are as important as the approach itself. So he used two approaches with these adolescents. One is cognitive behavior therapy, which is the standard treatment that focuses on thoughts and emotions. And he also used interpersonal therapy, which does focus more on uh, relationships. But he found that in both instances, that both treatments were effective because they were both culturally adapted using his principles of adaptation that include language and metaphors and religion and cultural context. So that's an example where a cultural adaptation enhanced these existing treatments to be more effective for this context of Puerto Rican adolescents who are depressed.
Interesting. And Gordon, have you postulated about what the future of this field could look like? The greater appreciation and understanding of culture and mental health, and how this could look in 10, 15, 20 years?
I think it has a bright future, but progress has been slow. As I mentioned, 88% of the psychology workforce in the United States is white, and there are many people who are older psychologists who were trained many years ago in traditional models, some of whom aren't that open to change. I am hopeful that the pipeline is more diverse. 30% of current psychology graduate students are not white. So there is promise for change, but change is slow. This 88% white demographic of the psychology workforce is similar to the United States demographics as a whole in 1988. So, in some ways, we're 40 years behind where the country is. So, there is pressure to diversify and become more multicultural, but progress has been slow, but it's been steady.
And how do you think that the United States could reach this? Of course, you talk about the increasing people studying, the non-white Americans that are studying in this area. But how do you think people outside, or how do you think, are there other ways that we can improve this?
Sure, I think it needs to happen when early in development, when children are going to school, they need to learn about different cultures. They need to be with people from different cultural backgrounds. That will happen more because the United States is diversifying, but it does take a conscious and deliberate effort to change an educational curriculum to become more multicultural. But that's just good practice to prepare a person to live in a multicultural society and to live in the future. So I think this kind of experience and education needs to happen when a person is young.
Thanks for that, Gordon. Yeah, this has been a really articulate, concise answering of our ponderings. I guess we could close. We usually ask our guests how they keep on top of their mental health, or are there any rituals or methods or routines that they have that really help them keep on top of their mental health?
Sure. So I exercise daily. I walk and run, and when I'm able to go to the gym, I lift weights. I do the weightlifting with two friends that provides a lot of social support. So that's part of my mental health. My family is very supportive, and that promotes my mental health as well. I have three adult children and now one granddaughter, and just my relationships with them are very rewarding. And my wife is my partner. She's an instructor in the College of Education at the University of Oregon, and we have great discussions about our work and about our lives. She's also a Japanese American, so we share culture and history. So family relationships and exercise help me stay grounded.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gordon, for sharing your expertise with us. It's been truly fascinating. Really, really enjoyed this podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Guys, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please like, rate, and subscribe. And if you know of anyone who may be forms part of an ethnic minority and is looking for help and may find this interesting, or anyone else for that matter who may find this interesting, please pass the podcast on and spread awareness as much as possible. But until next time, guys, stay safe. Bye.